In December 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt sat in his headquarters in the West and delivered an assessment that would have been unthinkable 4 years earlier. Germany was losing the war, he told his staff, and not because German soldiers lacked courage or German generals lacked skill. 3 factors defeated us in the West where I was in command, Rundstedt later explained to British military historian Basil Liddell Hart. First, the unheard-of superiority of your air force, which made all movement in daytime impossible. Second, the lack of motor fuel, oil and gas, so that the panzers and even the Luftwaffe were unable to move. Third, the systematic destruction of all railway communications, so that it was impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. Rundstedt's confession revealed a devastating truth. Allied air power had not merely won battles. It had systematically strangled German logistics, cutting fuel supplies and destroying railways until the Wehrmacht could barely move. But there was another side to this story that Rundstedt did not fully appreciate. While Allied bombers were crippling German supply lines, American logistics officers were building a supply system of unprecedented scale and efficiency. The trucks that delivered fuel, the ships that carried ammunition, the pipelines that pumped gasoline beneath the English Channel, the railroads that hauled supplies from the ports, these were the instruments that crushed the Third Reich. 8,000 miles away, in a motor pool somewhere in France, a 19-year-old African-American soldier named James Rookard was climbing into the cab of a 2.5-ton truck. He had never seen Europe before the war. He had never driven anything larger than a family automobile back home in Maple Heights, Ohio. Now he was part of something called the Red Ball Express, and his job was to drive supplies to General George Patton's tanks, which were racing across France faster than anyone believed possible. When General Patton said for you to be there, Rookard later recalled, you were there if you had to drive all day and all night. Those trucks just kept running. They would break down, we would fix them, and they would run again. Rundstedt believed the Americans were amateurs at war. Rookard was about to prove him catastrophically wrong. The misjudgment began long before the first American truck rolled onto French soil. In the years leading up to the invasion of Normandy, German military intelligence compiled detailed reports on American industrial capacity, military readiness, and what they perceived as national character. The conclusions were remarkably consistent across multiple assessments. America was a nation of businessmen and consumers, not warriors. Its military traditions were shallow compared to the centuries of Prussian excellence. Its soldiers were soft, pampered by a comfortable peacetime existence. Its officers were inexperienced, having never faced the crucible of European warfare. And its logistics system, while impressive on paper, would surely collapse under the pressure of actual combat against a determined enemy. German generals had reason for confidence in their own abilities. The Wehrmacht had perfected the art of mobile warfare through years of doctrinal development and practical experience. German panzer divisions had conquered Poland in weeks, France in a mere 6 weeks, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union in months. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it depended on speed, shock, and concentrated force at the point of attack. German officers were trained to seize the initiative, exploit success ruthlessly, and accept nothing less than total victory. What German doctrine did not emphasize was the mundane business of supply. Logistics was considered a secondary concern, something that competent staff officers handled in the background while brilliant field commanders won glory and promotions at the front. The best German officers gravitated naturally toward combat commands. Logistics assignments attracted lower quality talent. This was not accident, but deeply embedded military culture. The German tradition prized operational art above all else. Clausewitz had written about the genius of command, not the science of supply. The Americans approached war from an entirely different perspective. Their national tradition was not centuries of cavalry charges and infantry maneuvers across European battlefields. It was transcontinental railroads, spanning thousands of miles. It was nationwide trucking chains delivering goods from coast to coast. It was assembly line production that had revolutionized manufacturing. It was the movement of agricultural products and industrial materials across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. When American military planners looked at the challenge of invading Europe, they did not see primarily a tactical problem to be solved through battlefield brilliance. They saw a logistics problem. How do you move millions of men and tens of millions of tons of supplies across an ocean, land them on a hostile shore defended by a powerful enemy, and sustain them as they advance hundreds of miles into enemy territory? The answer required innovations that German planners never anticipated and could scarcely imagine. The transformation of American logistics capability began months before a single soldier landed in Normandy. In England, Lieutenant General John Clifford Hodges Lee commanded what was officially designated the Communications Zone, the vast rear area organization responsible for everything from ammunition to food to medical supplies to toilet paper. Lee was a controversial figure in every respect. Deeply religious and administratively brilliant, he was also personally insufferable to many who worked with him. His initials were JCH, which soldiers said stood for Jesus Christ himself, a reference to both his initials and his intense religiosity. Others called him Courthouse Lee. Eisenhower called him a modern Cromwell, conceding that his unyielding methods might be vital to success in an activity where an iron hand is always mandatory. Under Lee's demanding command, 2.5 million tons of supplies were stockpiled across England before the invasion. Approximately 62.5 million square feet of storage space was created in warehouses, depots, and temporary facilities scattered across southern England. The Communications Zone organization grew to hundreds of thousands of personnel, an entire army behind the army, whose sole job was to ensure that the fighting men never lacked for anything they needed to continue fighting. But stockpiling supplies in England was the relatively easy part of the problem. The hard part was getting those supplies across the English Channel and delivering them to the front lines as the armies advanced inland. And this is where American ingenuity and British engineering produced something the Germans never imagined possible. Winston Churchill had sketched the basic concept as early as 1917 during the First World War, piers for use on beaches. He wrote in a memorandum dated May 30, 1942. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. What emerged from that directive after years of secret development were the Mulberry harbours, 2 complete artificial ports that would be constructed in England, towed in pieces across the English Channel, and assembled off the Normandy beaches. Each harbour, when completed, enclosed approximately 2 square miles of protected water, roughly the area of Dover Harbour. Construction required 45,000 workers, organised into approximately 300 engineering companies, working in shipyards and construction facilities across Britain. The structures consumed roughly 1.5 million tons of steel and concrete. 213 massive concrete caissons called Phoenix units, some of the largest weighing over 6,000 tons each, formed the outer breakwaters that would protect the harbours from channel storms. Approximately 10 miles of floating roadways called whales were manufactured in total, connecting the harbours to the shore and allowing trucks and vehicles to drive directly from ships to land. The Germans had built the Atlantic Wall fortifications on the fundamental assumption that any Allied invasion would require capturing a major port to supply the landing forces. They had heavily fortified every significant port from Norway to Spain. What they never imagined, what they apparently never even considered as a possibility, was that the Allies would simply bring their own ports with them. Reich Armaments Minister Albert Speer later admitted the devastating truth of this failure of imagination. To construct our defences, he said after the war, we had in 2 years used some 13 million cubic metres of concrete and 1.5 million tons of steel. A fortnight after the Normandy landings, this costly effort was brought to nothing because of an idea of simple genius. As we now know, the invasion force brought their own harbours and built at Arromanches and Omaha on unprotected coast the necessary landing ramps. German air reconnaissance aircraft had actually spotted the massive Phoenix caissons in British waters before the invasion. Pilots reported seeing enormous concrete structures that defied easy explanation. But German intelligence analysts had no idea what they were seeing or how these giant concrete containers would be used. The failure was not of intelligence gathering but of imagination. German planners simply could not conceive of building artificial harbours because building artificial harbours of this scale had never been done before in the history of warfare. By June 18, 12 days after the initial D-Day landings, both Mulberry harbours were nearly fully operational. The American Mulberry at Omaha Beach and the British Mulberry at Gold Beach near Arromanches were each designed to handle 7,000 tons of supplies and 2,500 vehicles per day. The invasion was succeeding beyond even optimistic expectations. Then, nature intervened with devastating force. Between June 19 and June 22, the worst June gale to hit the Normandy coast in 40 years struck with full fury. Force 6 to 8 winds generated 8-foot waves that battered the artificial harbours relentlessly for 3 terrible days. The American Mulberry at Omaha Beach was destroyed beyond any hope of repair. Floating roadways broke apart. Phoenix caissons shifted and sank. The entire elaborate structure was reduced to wreckage. General Omar Bradley visited the scene of destruction and wiped sea spray from his eyes and kicked the sand in frustration at what the storm had accomplished that German defences had failed to achieve. Ammunition supplies crashed from 25,000 tons on June 18 to just 4,000 tons on June 20. The disaster would have paralysed a less adaptable military force. The American response was characteristically pragmatic. They quickly decided to abandon the destroyed harbour entirely, salvaged every usable component to reinforce the surviving British Mulberry at Arromanches, and reverted to landing supplies directly on the beaches using specialised landing craft. Remarkably, Utah and Omaha beach offloading rates actually surpassed those achieved through the artificial harbour system. American engineers and Navy personnel developed techniques for beaching landing ships at high tide and unloading them directly onto the sand. The surviving British Mulberry operated successfully for 10 months, handling over 2 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies before it was finally closed. But the harbours were only part of the logistics miracle. The Allies also constructed something that remained completely secret throughout the war, and for years afterward, hidden from German intelligence entirely. Operation PLUTO, which stood for Pipelines Under the Ocean, was the world's first undersea oil pipeline system. Conceived in April 1942 by Lord Louis Mountbatten and engineered primarily by A.C. Hartley of Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the system used flexible pipelines laid across the floor of the English Channel to pump fuel directly from storage facilities in England to distribution points in France. 2 main routes were established through immense engineering effort. The first, codenamed Bambi, ran approximately 70 miles from the Isle of Wight to the port of Cherbourg on the Cotentin Peninsula. The second, codenamed Dumbo, stretched about 30 miles from Dungeness on the English coast to Boulogne on the French coast. Pumping stations were elaborately disguised to prevent German detection or attack. At Shanklin on the Isle of Wight, pumps hid inside the carefully preserved ruins of a bombed hotel, and buildings were camouflaged as innocent civilian structures, including one disguised as an ice cream parlour, complete with appropriate signage. The Bambi system to Cherbourg proved technically disappointing, plagued by anchor damage from ships, barnacle accumulation, and pipe failures. It delivered only about 3,300 tons total before being abandoned as impractical. The Dumbo system to Boulogne was far more successful. It eventually expanded to 17 separate pipelines running side by side across the channel floor, reaching a peak delivery rate of 4,500 tons of fuel per day by the end of the war. Total fuel delivered through Pluto reached approximately 180 million imperial gallons, representing about 8% of all petroleum products sent from Britain to support Allied forces fighting in Europe. There is no strong evidence that Germany ever identified, located, or understood Pluto's existence. The Allies were pumping millions of gallons of fuel beneath the sea, and the Germans never knew it was happening. While Pluto was feeding fuel directly to France, another logistics miracle was taking place at Cherbourg itself. When American forces captured the vital port on June 26, 1944, they found what military engineers described as the most complete, intensive, and best-planned demolition in history. Hitler had personally awarded a Knight's Cross to Rear Admiral Walter Hennecke for the thoroughness of the destruction. Every quay was demolished, every crane was destroyed, every lock was sabotaged. Ships were deliberately sunk to block the harbour channels. The entire port was extensively mined with delayed action explosives. German commanders expected Cherbourg to remain unusable for months. American engineers proved them catastrophically wrong. The rehabilitation was led by the 1056th Engineer Group and Navy Seabees, working around the clock in shifts. The first deep draft ship offloaded cargo on July 16, just 20 days after the port's capture. By September, more than 14,000 tons of supplies per day were flowing through Cherbourg's reconstructed facilities. By November, the port approached its designed capacity of 25,000 tons per day. A peacetime port that had handled less than 800 tons daily was now processing more than 30 times that volume. The port of Marseille, captured on August 28, 1944, following Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, became the largest single American supply port in Europe. By mid-October, Marseille was delivering over 91,000 tons per week, approximately one-third of total Allied requirements. Together with the smaller ports along the French Mediterranean coast, the southern supply line proved essential to sustaining Allied operations as armies pushed toward Germany. While the harbours were being assembled and the pipelines were being laid across the Channel floor, another logistics operation was taking shape on French soil that would become legendary in military history. On August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated from German occupation, the Red Ball Express began its historic operations. The name came from railroad terminology, where a red ball painted on freight cars indicated priority cargo that received expedited handling. This was priority freight on wheels, a massive truck convoy system designed to rush supplies from the Normandy beaches and ports to the rapidly advancing Allied front lines. The challenge facing logistics planners was unprecedented in scope and urgency. Allied armies were advancing across France so fast that they were literally outrunning their own supply lines. General George Patton's Third Army had covered 400 miles from the Normandy hedgerows to the Moselle River in eastern France in less than a single month. Every mile of this dazzling tactical advance worsened the strategic supply crisis. 600,000 tons of supplies sat stockpiled in Normandy depots, waiting to be moved forward. The problem was never quantity of supplies. The problem was the inability to transport those supplies forward fast enough to sustain the advancing armies. The Red Ball Express solved this problem through sheer organizational brute force and human determination. The system used two parallel highways that were reserved exclusively for Red Ball convoy traffic. The northern route carried loaded trucks east toward the front lines. The southern route returned empty trucks west for reloading at the supply depots. All civilian traffic was strictly banned from these routes. All non-Red Ball military traffic was forbidden. Routes were clearly marked, with large rectangular signs bearing huge red balls painted on white backgrounds, and the slogan, "Red Ball Highway, stay on the ball, keep M rolling." The operation was conceived during an intense 36-hour brainstorming session led by Colonel Lorin Ayers, whom soldiers nicknamed Little Patton for his demanding leadership style, and Major Gordon Gravel at Communications Zone Headquarters. Brigadier General Ewart Plank, tasked with implementing the system under impossible time pressure, declared as the first trucks rolled, "Let it never be said that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans couldn't." Over its 82 days of continuous operation, from August 25 to November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,193 tons of supplies across France. At its peak, the system employed a fleet of over 5,000 trucks. 23,000 drivers and mechanics kept the enormous system running around the clock. On its single peak day, August 29, 5,958 vehicles carried 12,342 tons of cargo in a single 24-hour period. The primary vehicle was the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, affectionately known to soldiers as the Deuce and a Half or simply the Jimmy. These rugged trucks were routinely overloaded to carry 5 tons of cargo, double their official rated capacity, because the need was desperate and the trucks could handle the strain. 2 drivers were assigned to each truck, alternating between driving and sleeping in the cab. Sometimes exhausted drivers switched seats while the truck was still rolling down the road to save precious minutes. Routes that initially stretched 125 miles from Saint-Lô to Chartres eventually extended to 400 miles one way, as the front raced steadily eastward toward Germany. The men who drove these trucks faced dangers that frontline combat soldiers would immediately recognize as genuine hazards of war. German aircraft strafed the truck convoys whenever they could penetrate Allied air cover. Mines were planted along the routes by German stay-behind forces and saboteurs. Piano wire was strung across roads at neck height, designed to decapitate drivers and passengers in open vehicles. Jeeps traveling with convoys were equipped with angle iron hooks welded to their front bumpers to snag the deadly wire before it could kill anyone. Windshields were often driven down or removed entirely near the front lines to avoid sun glints that might trigger German artillery observers to call in fire. Cab floors were sandbagged to provide some protection against mine blasts from below. At night, driving was done under complete blackout conditions, using only tiny running lights, soldiers called cat eyes, that were barely visible even from close range. Approximately 73% of all Red Ball Express drivers were African American, roughly 17,000 of the 23,000 personnel involved in the operation. The United States Army was fully segregated in 1944. Military leaders had relegated black troops to service and supply units based on deeply held racist assumptions about intelligence, courage, and capability for combat. The Red Ball Express proved those assumptions catastrophically wrong every single day it operated. Washington Rector of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company described the segregated reality that black soldiers faced, even while performing vital service. "You accepted discrimination," he recalled. "We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise." Despite this treatment, the drivers performed their duties with extraordinary dedication. A 5th Armored Division tank driver offered the combat troops perspective on the men who kept them supplied. "If it was not for the Red Ball," he said, "we could not have moved at all. They all were black drivers, and they delivered in the heat of combat. We would be in our tanks praying for them to come up with fuel and ammunition." Stars and Stripes, the official military newspaper, published an Armored Division commander's assessment on August 31, 1944. "Our Negro outfits delivered gas under constant fire. Damned if I would want their job. They have what it takes." Colonel John Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son and himself a military officer, later wrote that the spectacular nature of the advance across France was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks that made the headlines. What made this achievement remarkable was that it drew upon distinctly American strengths. The drivers came from a nation accustomed to great distances, to transcontinental railways, to nationwide trucking operations, to endless roads and millions of automobiles. They brought skills and attitudes shaped by that experience to the battlefields of Europe. The Red Ball consumed resources at a staggering rate. The trucks themselves burned over 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just to operate the convoy system. On extended routes, trucks consumed 40 to 50% of the fuel they were carrying, simply moving themselves forward. In the first month of operation alone, Red Ball trucks wore out 40,000 tires. Drivers routinely disabled engine governors, pushing trucks to 56 or even 60 miles per hour, well beyond the official 25 mile per hour speed limit, destroying the vehicles faster but delivering supplies sooner. By the time the Red Ball officially ended on November 16, the system had worn out trucks faster than they could be replaced. The Red Ball was the most famous supply route, but it was far from the only one. The White Ball Express operated from October 6 of 1944 to January 6, 1945, hauling supplies from Le Havre and Rouen to Paris. The Red Lion Express ran from September 13 to October 12, covering approximately 300 miles from Bayeux to Brussels to support Montgomery's 21st Army Group and Operation Market Garden. The ABC Express operated from November 30, 1944 to March 26, 1945, connecting Antwerp to Brussels, Liège, and Charleroi, hauling approximately 244,000 tons. The XYZ Express, beginning March 25, 1945, ran 4 separate routes into Germany itself, averaging 13,000 tons daily and delivering approximately 870,000 tons total. Behind these truck routes operated another essential American logistics system that received far less attention. The United States Military Railway Service operated approximately 43,500 soldier railroaders by Victory in Europe Day. These men, many of them experienced railroad workers in civilian life, loaded and moved more than 18 million tons of military freight across Western Europe during the campaign. The Military Railway Service repaired bombed tracks, rebuilt destroyed bridges, and operated captured locomotives using whatever fuel they could obtain. Without the railroads, the Red Ball trucks alone could never have sustained the enormous American armies advancing toward Germany. The Germans watched this logistical miracle unfold with growing alarm as their own supply systems simultaneously collapsed. The fundamental difference between American and German military logistics was not merely quantitative, but structural and civilizational. Approximately 80% of the German army's motive power was horse-drawn throughout the entire war. The Wehrmacht maintained an average of 1.1 million horses at any given time, employing over 2.75 million horses total during the conflict. Each standard German infantry division of the old type required roughly 5,300 horses and 1,100 horse-drawn vehicles simply to move. These animals consumed 53 tons of hay and oats per day, nearly equal to the division's food requirement for all its human soldiers. Of 322 German divisions in existence in November 1943, only 52 were armoured or fully motorised, 16%. The remaining 84% of German divisions marched on foot with horse-drawn supply trains that could cover only about 5 miles per day under adverse weather conditions. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, specifically ordered that only mechanized traffic was to be filmed for newsreels and propaganda purposes, carefully creating the enduring myth of a fully motorized Wehrmacht that persists in popular imagination. The reality on the ground was very different. A German soldier recorded in his diary the truth that newsreels never showed. Our route is lined by dead horses that have broken their legs or collapsed through sheer exhaustion. The Wehrmacht maintained an enormous infrastructure dedicated solely to keeping its horses functioning as military transport. 236 veterinary companies, 48 veterinary hospitals, and 68 horse transport units existed simply to care for the animals upon which German logistics depended. The contrast in truck production alone was militarily decisive. The United States produced approximately 2.4 million military trucks during the war. Germany produced roughly 375,000, a ratio of better than 6-to-1 in American favor. The workhorse GMC CCKW alone accounted for approximately 572,500 units, rolling off American assembly lines. Eisenhower listed this single vehicle type among the 4 pieces of equipment that senior officers came to regard as most vital to Allied success, alongside the bulldozer, the Jeep, and the C-47 transport aircraft. The fuel disparity was equally devastating to German hopes. American domestic oil production in 1940 stood at approximately 1.5 billion barrels annually. Germany produced about 3.8 million barrels of domestic crude oil in 1938, a staggering ratio of roughly 400-to-1 in American favor. Germany depended desperately on synthetic fuel plants using coal conversion technology and Romanian oil from the Ploesti fields. When Allied strategic bombers began systematically attacking these critical sources in May 1944, German military logistics began an irreversible collapse. German synthetic fuel production fell catastrophically from approximately 92,000 barrels per day to about 5,000 barrels per day by September 1944. A 95% reduction in just 4 months. Ploesti fell to Soviet forces on August 23, 1944, eliminating Germany's last major source of natural petroleum. By February 1945, German synthetic aviation fuel production stood at just 1,000 tons monthly, 0.5% of early 1944 levels. German pilots and tank commanders increasingly found themselves with magnificent machines and no fuel to operate them. The Wehrmacht, that had conquered most of Europe in stunning campaigns, was reduced to scrounging for supplies like a desperate beggar. One small but critical detail illustrated the comprehensive nature of American logistics superiority. The humble fuel container, the jerrycan, was actually a German invention. The Wehrmacht designed the elegant 20-liter Einheitscanister in 1937, featuring 3 handles for efficient bucket brigade passing, a tool-free opening mechanism, and an interior lining that prevented rust and contamination. American engineer Paul Pleiss, working in Berlin before the war, recognized the design's superiority and smuggled plans and sample containers out of Germany. The United States military initially ignored his intelligence. American fuel cans were inferior in every respect, with rolled seams that leaked, designs that required a funnel and wrench to open, and no protective inner lining. Navy Commander Richard Daniel reported in September 1942 that American cans were losing enormous quantities of fuel shipped to North Africa through evaporation and spillage, an estimate he deliberately made alarming to provoke action from Washington. The British had already captured thousands of German cans in Norway, and manufactured 2 million competent copies of the superior German design. President Franklin Roosevelt later acknowledged the jerry can's importance. "Without these cans," he stated in November 1944, "it would have been impossible for our armies to cut across France at a lightning pace which exceeded the German blitzkrieg of 1940. By May 1945, over 19 million jerry cans were required in the European theatre. In October 1944 alone, 3.5 million cans were reported lost, mostly to pilferage by soldiers who used them for everything from water storage to makeshift stoves. The Germans had designed the perfect fuel container, but could not produce enough fuel to fill their own cans. Germany's rail network, which carried over 97% of commercial freight before the war, was systematically destroyed by Allied strategic bombing. German freight car loadings fell from approximately 900,000 per week in August 1944 to about 214,000 per week by March 1945. After that date, according to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, disorganization was so great that no useful statistics were kept. German railroad coal stocks dropped from 18 days' supply in October 1944 to just 4 days' supply in February 1945. The survey concluded that the attack on transportation was the decisive blow that completely disorganized the German economy. When the railroads failed, Germany had no alternative. The Americans could switch seamlessly between rail, truck, pipeline, and shipping. The Germans were left with horses. Yet even American logistics faced limits that became painfully apparent in the autumn of 1944. In late August and early September, the magnificent Allied advance across France ground to a frustrating halt, not because of German military resistance, but because of supply constraints. By August 31, Patton's Third Army ran completely dry near the Moselle River, receiving only 32,000 of the 400,000 gallons of fuel required daily for full offensive operations. Patton told Omar Bradley, in characteristically colorful language, that with 400,000 gallons he could be in Germany within 2 days. For 5 agonizing days in early September, the Third Army, the war's most dynamic offensive force, sat essentially idle while its commander raged impotently. The great argument between Eisenhower's broad front strategy and Montgomery's narrow thrust proposal was fundamentally a logistics argument about how to allocate scarce transport capacity across competing commands, not a purely tactical or strategic debate. As one official army history noted with precision, once beyond the Seine, logistics, not tactics, dominated the situation entirely. The capture of Antwerp on September 4, 1944, should have solved the Allied supply crisis immediately. British forces took the massive port virtually intact, aided critically by Belgian resistance fighters, who protected vital dock facilities from German demolition teams. But the 55-mile Scheldt estuary leading from the sea to Antwerp's docks remained firmly in German hands. Clearing it required a brutal month-long campaign that cost 12,873 Allied casualties, including over 6,000 Canadian soldiers killed and wounded in bitter fighting through flooded polders. The first Allied supply ships did not dock at Antwerp until November 28, nearly 3 months after the port was captured. Hitler responded to the eventual loss of Antwerp with unprecedented fury. He ordered a sustained V-weapon bombardment that made Antwerp the most heavily attacked city by rocket weapons in the entire war. Approximately 2,400 V-1 flying bombs and 1,600 V-2 ballistic missiles struck the Antwerp area, more V-2 rockets than London received during the entire war. The Rex Cinema disaster on December 16, 1944, killed 567 people in a single V-2 strike while they watched a film. Antwerp earned the grim nickname, the City of Sudden Death, among Allied soldiers and Belgian civilians. Despite this terror campaign that continued until March 1945, the port never stopped operating. In the first half of 1945, Antwerp averaged approximately 500,000 tons of supplies per month flowing to Allied forces. Hitler's primary objective in launching the Battle of the Bulge offensive in December 1944 was to recapture Antwerp and deny the Allies its crucial port facilities, which reveals how clearly even the German dictator understood that logistics, not battlefield tactics, determined the war's ultimate outcome. When 200,000 German troops launched the Ardennes offensive on December 16, 1944, They were gambling desperately that they could capture Allied fuel dumps to sustain their own advance toward Antwerp. German forces entered the offensive with approximately 5 million gallons of fuel stockpiled, enough for only 6 days of combat operations, at full intensity, and sufficient to cover only 1/3 to 1/2 the distance to Antwerp under actual combat conditions with resistance. Hitler's operational plan literally required capturing massive Allied fuel depots to continue the advance after the initial breakthrough. This gamble failed catastrophically within the first days of the offensive. American forces quickly evacuated their massive fuel storage depots near Spa, Stavelot, and Malmedy before advancing German spearheads could seize them. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the elite SS armored battle group led by Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper that formed the main German striking force, captured only about 50,000 gallons of fuel at Bullingen against an operational need for millions. Peiper's powerful armored force took 36 hours to advance from the Eifel to Stavelot, a distance that German forces had covered in just 9 hours during the 1940 campaign against France. He eventually ran completely out of fuel at La Glaise on December 23 and led 770 survivors on foot through the snow back to German lines, abandoning every tank, half-track, and vehicle. The American logistics response to the German Bulge offensive became what military historians call one of the finest organizational achievements of the entire war. Before the famous December 19 meeting at Verdun, where Patton stunned assembled commanders by declaring he could attack northward with 3 divisions in 48 hours, he had already secretly ordered his staff to prepare 3 separate contingency plans for exactly this situation. His Third Corps performed a 90-degree pivot turn from facing east toward Germany to attacking north into the German flank. The logistics numbers behind this maneuver remain staggering 8 decades later. Third Army staff shifted 63,000 tons of supplies in 5 days. They moved an average of 4,500 tons of ammunition per day forward to new positions. They distributed 57 tons of new maps showing the changed operational area. They reconnoitered 2,800 miles of road for the reoriented advance. They strung 20,000 miles of communications wire to new headquarters locations and established dozens of new supply depots. The attack jumped off on December 22 as scheduled. Besieged American forces in Bastogne received aerial resupply beginning December 23, when weather finally cleared enough for aircraft to fly. 241 transport aircraft dropped approximately 239 tons of desperately needed supplies in just 4 hours on the first day alone. Total aerial delivery over the following days reached over 1,000 tons by parachute and 92 additional tons by glider, including nearly 8,000 gallons of fuel for armored vehicles defending the town. On December 26, tank forces led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams broke through German encirclement to relieve the garrison and open a ground supply corridor. Meanwhile, Red Ball Express trucks rushed urgently to evacuate fuel from threatened depots before German forces could capture them. All but 124,000 gallons were successfully moved to safety over 3 frantic days. Those 124,000 gallons that could not be evacuated in time were deliberately ignited near Stavelot, creating a massive flaming roadblock that helped stop German armored vehicles attempting to advance westward. Omar Bradley captured the fundamental asymmetry between American and German capabilities in a single observation. Hitler had forgotten, Bradley wrote after the war, that this time he was opposed not by static troops in a Maginot Line, but by a vast, mechanized US Army fully mounted on wheels. By the end of March 1945, all 4 American armies fighting in Western Europe had crossed the Rhine into Germany itself. The Rhine crossings rivaled Normandy in logistical ambition and execution. For Operation Plunder on March 23 and 24, 432 trains delivered 230,000 tons of supplies to 37 forward railheads. Ninth Army alone stockpiled 46,000 long tons of ammunition, representing 20 days' full supply, and 3 million gallons of fuel, representing 10 days' supply before the assault began. At Wesel, American combat engineers constructed a 1,152-foot tactical bridge in just 6 hours and 15 minutes, establishing a record. 5 permanent railway bridges were eventually built across the Rhine to sustain the final advance, including the massive Duisburg Bridge, completed in approximately 6.5 days. The German generals, who had dismissed American logistics capability early in the war, watched these operations unfold with growing professional despair in their final months of resistance. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, writing in his papers before his forced suicide in October 1944, had already grasped what Germany faced. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, he wrote, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant theorist and practitioner who fathered blitzkrieg armored doctrine, reportedly observed that logistics is the ball and chain of armored warfare. Whether or not he used those exact words, the irony was historically devastating. Germany had invented modern armored warfare but never truly solved its demanding supply requirements. The Americans, arriving late to mechanized combat, solved the logistics problem comprehensively. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who served as the last German supreme commander in the West during the final desperate months, captured the despair of facing American abundance when German forces lacked everything. Leading German armies in 1945, he said bitterly, was like playing a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. The statistics of American logistics achievement told the story with brutal mathematical clarity. American industry provided almost two-thirds of all Allied military equipment produced during the entire war. Nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2 million army trucks. The communications zone delivered nearly 48 million tons of supplies to the European continent by Victory in Europe Day. American forces in Europe consumed over 1.6 million gallons of gasoline daily during active offensive operations. Patton's Third Army alone burned through 400,000 gallons per day during the pursuit across France. The entire German war machine could not sustain such consumption because the entire German war machine could never produce such quantities of fuel. The fundamental contrast between American and German logistics was not merely marginal difference, it was civilizational divergence. The United States approached modern war as essentially an industrial problem to be solved through organization, standardization, and overwhelming material superiority. Germany approached war as an operational art to be mastered through brilliant generalship, superior training, and tactical excellence at the decisive point. When the two systems collided on the battlefields of Western Europe, the industrial approach won decisively. The German military maintained three separate, uncoordinated supply systems for the Army, Air Force, and Navy, each jealously guarding its own resources and refusing efficient cooperation. The Americans created a unified theater-level logistics command under the communications zone that could shift resources across service boundaries as operational needs demanded. German vehicles came in over 100 different types from multiple manufacturers and conquered nations, creating a maintenance nightmare where spare parts for one vehicle could not be used in another apparently similar machine. American trucks and jeeps were standardized around a handful of basic designs with interchangeable components that could be manufactured at scale and repaired by any trained mechanic using standard tools. The German system punished failure ruthlessly. After the July 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, his paranoia intensified dramatically. Generals suspected of disloyalty or defeatism were executed. This created a culture of terrified conformity at precisely the moment when honest assessment and adaptive thinking were most desperately needed. Officers who recognized the impossibility of their strategic situation often said nothing because speaking the truth to superiors had become literally fatal. The American system tolerated failure as a learning experience. Commanders who lost battles were relieved of their positions but rarely punished criminally. Their hard-won experience, even failed experience, was considered valuable institutional knowledge. The lessons of defeat were analyzed by staff officers, documented in after-action reports, and disseminated through training programs to commanders who had not yet faced similar challenges. The organization as a whole became steadily more effective even when individual components struggled badly. The Germans assigned their best officers to combat commands where they could win glory and advancement. The Americans understood that logistics officers, supply sergeants, and transportation specialists were just as essential to victory as infantry captains and tank commanders. The communications zone staff that kept supplies flowing included some of the Army's most capable administrators, men who could have held prominent positions in American corporations after the war, and many of whom did exactly that. The roads that carried the Red Ball Express trucks are ordinary civilian highways now, carrying commercial traffic and daily commuters. The beaches where the Mulberry harbors once protected Allied shipping are peaceful tourist destinations visited by history enthusiasts. The pipelines that pumped fuel beneath the English Channel have long since been removed from the sea floor. The war that these logistics operations helped win ended 8 decades ago. But the story matters because logistics still determines outcomes in great conflicts between nations. Leaders still underestimate their adversaries based on comfortable assumptions. Organizations still fail because they prioritize the dramatic over the essential. The German High Command believed what it wanted to believe about America, and that belief led to catastrophic strategic miscalculation. The truck drivers who delivered supplies through mud and snow and enemy fire across France were not supermen endowed with special abilities. They were ordinary young Americans who did extraordinary things when their nation demanded it. The welders who built the ships had never imagined themselves working in shipyards before the war transformed their lives. The engineers who laid the pipelines beneath the channel had never attempted anything remotely similar. The soldiers who loaded and unloaded millions of tons of cargo had never imagined themselves as the essential foundation of military victory rather than its dramatic tip. They accomplished these things regardless. They learned skills they had never possessed. They endured hardships they had never anticipated. They achieved feats that pre-war experts declared impossible. And when the war ended, most of them returned to ordinary lives and rarely spoke about what they had accomplished during those extraordinary years. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their families to history enthusiasts everywhere. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.